Black Horse, welcome to the Gauntlet.
How are you doing?
I'm good. You are, I think, the fourth guest, so I'm starting to get the hang of how this works.
Okay, well, it's the first time for me because these are pre-records. So,
That's true, yes. None of the guests will have the advantage of seeing anybody else's episodes before the whole season goes live. I'm doing it like a proper... That's how they record real game shows, I think. Let's pick a first category. Would you like music, economics, or cosmology?
well, definitely not cosmology. We'll go with economics.
Great. Here are your three potential assertions. Carbon pricing is the most efficient way to combat climate change. Progressive taxation reduces inequality.
Okay.
Or the privatization of healthcare leads to inefficiencies. So you can either choose the positive or negative side of any of these statements.
Okay. Progressive taxation reduces inequality. I could definitely defend progressive taxation reducing inequality.
All right, that sounds fun. Let's do it. Take it
All
away.
right. So, the basis for human inequality is kind of twofold. There's the return on capital from accumulated goods, and there's income inequality, which is fundamentally based on the the disequality between people. So one person can produce 20 widgets, another person can produce 10 widgets. It is one source of that inequality, and a second source of that inequality is the ability to leverage power to increase the inequality of the fruits of that labor. So there's an inequality in productive capacity between people. There's also an inequality of power, which allows for the harvesting of those goods
Is the latter
unequally.
sounds a little similar to the Marx analysis of ownership of the means of production?
Yeah, I mean the first piece, the accumulation of capital as a mechanism for the forwarding of inequality, that's just simply true, and it happens that Marx notices it. But you can think of economic productivity as an iterative reinvestment game, kind of like Monopoly. So the more capital you accumulate, the more, because that capital increases productivity, if invested wisely, on a long enough time scale, that invested capital leads to inequality. So fair enough. So that's one piece. The Marxists will go on to make an argument about how that's inherently unfair and should warrant redistribution, but it's a fact. The other two elements related to income inequality, the inequality of productive capacity and the inequality of the inequality of power leading to unequal ability to kind of be exploitative in the economy, are really the two facets that progressive taxation affects. And there's a competing narrative going on here. So progressive taxation, because it hits people with higher productive capacity more than it hits people with lower productive capacity, it inherently reduces equality through that mechanism. On the other hand, progressive taxation, because it tends to lead to larger accumulations of tax, you tend to get higher tax harvests out of progressive taxation than you get out of flat taxation. It tends to lead to more power accumulated within the state and therefore more effective exploitation. So it's got a mechanism that is anti-equality, which is the increased accumulation of power by the owner of the tax monopoly, and you've got a mechanism towards equality from the application of taxes differentially to higher productivity individuals. So the question of whether progressive taxation increases or decreases inequality depends on whether exploitation of the taxation monopoly in order to harvest is a dominant factor in economic inequality, or whether differences in productive capacity is a dominant factor in that particular in inequality in that particular society. I would suggest that inequality between people at the sort of middle and people at the very top of society is dominated by power differentials, and differences between people at the bottom and people at the middle is dominated by differences in productive capacity. And I would suggest that the inequality that people really notice is the difference between people at the bottom and people at the middle. And that inequality, as far as I can tell, is overwhelmingly driven by the fact that people at the bottom produce nothing and people at the middle produce something.
So this is really an argument that progressive taxation reduces the perception of inequality.
No. So progressive taxation reduces one kind of inequality and increases one kind of inequality. And the question is, which is more relevant to the question? Well, I would suggest that
the middle to the top of society, does that not really dominate the overall? Like, if you were to measure inequality in the whole of society, the difference between the bottom and the middle is relatively small difference, even if measured in terms of money rather than.
It depends on how you look at it. Is the difference between 0 and 50,000 greater than the difference between 50,000 and 1 million? Well, in absolute terms, yes. By percentage, no. And in terms of the human experience, it depends where the middle is. Right. Yeah. So I would suggest that the most important difference is whether it is the difference between absolute poverty and not absolute poverty, right? And progressive taxation is an extremely effective vehicle for producing a condition where either everyone's in absolute poverty or very few people are in absolute poverty, by flattening the middle towards the bottom and the bottom towards the middle.
Okay, let me attempt to make a counter argument, but this is an area you know a lot more about than me, so you may be able to correct me. But am I right? The Laffer curve is the concept that there's a sweet spot of there's if you tax nothing, you have no income, no nothing to spend from raised taxes, and if you tax too highly, then you make everybody, you destroy the economy, and
people avoid taxes is the actual.
So if you were to measure the tax rate on one axis and the revenue produced by taxing on the other axis, you will have some point between 0 and 100% taxation at which you've generated the maximum revenue. And in terms of like reducing absolute poverty, you actually want as much money to play with as possible. So in terms of reducing inequality, the amount that you take away doesn't matter so much as the amount. So could you argue that progressive taxation it reduces the incentive of the middle, the people who are highly productive to work hard?
So you could argue that progressive taxation retards the productivity of the economy, and you'd be correct to make that argument. But so there's pieces to kind of pull apart on that. First of all, the Laffer curve doesn't say very much about the mechanism by which taxes are raised, just the absolute charges that are levied against it. So the concept of progressive taxation is the idea that, between $0 and $10,000, you charge nothing in tax. Between 10,000 25,000, you charge 5%, and etc. You have an accelerating rate of extraction the higher up the income curve you go. And what that does is it takes the kind of in every place that it has ever been implemented, the consequences of progressive taxation have been that the high-end professional class people are taxed very aggressively. So these are people who are not in the ownership class of a society, but they're doctors, lawyers, people who provide professional services that are very valuable, but people who aren't part of the ownership class of the society and therefore aren't really able to avoid taxation. And so these are the people that you're taxing, and you're driving their take-home income downward. The other thing that is a universal consequence of progressive taxation is that you create a relationship between the ownership class of a society and the people living in absolute poverty of kind of client patron, because by structuring taxation in this way, you're rewarding people who make very little money with a 0% tax rate, and you're punishing people in the middle, so they become your political enemies. That structure means that it is typical practice to redistribute the taxed gains in the middle to the bottom and the top, right? Which reduces inequality going downward and increases inequality going upward. That's the structure you get in a society that has progressive taxation. And not only that, it's a pretty effective system at maximizing the extracted tax revenue. So you tend to get a strong state out of a progressive taxation framework.
Okay, last question on this round.
Sure.
There's sort of a cap on absolute salaries, in that, for example, in Silicon Valley, they have this problem that if you pay people too much, then they just retire, or they no longer do their productive work. They start. I guess this is almost a transition to becoming part of the ownership class. If you now that cap is based on take-home salary. So if you increase the taxation of the highest band, then the effective behavior of companies will be that they'll increase the top band of salaries, and on the basis that they still want to offer their employees as much money as they can get away with without their employees' behavior changing. And therefore the perception of the people on the lower rungs will be that, you know how it is, that people will
perceived inequality
pre-tax salary, won't they?
Yeah. Perceived inequality is a very different beast than actual inequality, and it depends on a lot of factors that are very unpredictable just from tax systems. So I don't know quite how to answer that question, right?
Okay, I think that's a fair answer. The question is about actual inequality rather than perceived inequality in a way.
Yeah, I mean, perceived inequality, I think, is primarily a political construct. And so you'd have to know a lot about other elements of the society, not just the tax policy, to kind of be able to discuss that.
Well, let's bring that round to a close. I have to give you a 10. Now, this isn't a 10 out of 10. 10 just represents exceptionally good answer at the moment.
All right, there you go.
I'm willing to give out higher or lower numbers, but 10 is above average so far. I'm pretty sure.
Has anyone ever gotten a negative yet?
Nobody's got a negative. I'm far too polite to my guests to do that, but I think we've had range between 8 and 11 so far. Somebody did get.
There you go. There you go.
There's something to strive for. Next round: ethics, history, or metaphysics.
I'm thinking history.
Let's do it. The legacy of colonialism has produced global inequality. Religion is the most potent force in shaping civilizations, or historical materialism is the most explanatory framework for history.
Historical materialism is the most explanatory framework.
And which way are you going to be arguing this?
No. Sorry, I'm trying to consider this question.
Sorry.
I mean, the easiest one to answer is the legacy of colonialism is inequality. The answer to that is very obviously no. And so there's really two elements to this argument, and it's extremely straightforward. The first element to this argument is that colonialism did not substantively increase the wealth of the colonial powers, right? So it increased the wealth of some elements of the colonial powers, but on balance, for example, the British Empire was posted a red line on P&L, for every year that the British Empire ever existed. So it's true that within Britain, colonialism was very good for some people, but in aggregate for the civilization, it was not economically positive. On the other hand, if colonialism was a driver of inequality, it would have to have impoverished the nations which were colonial holdings. I think there's extremely limited evidence for this, and I think the easiest way to note that there's limited evidence is that there are wide-ranging economic outcomes for those societies which were never colonized. So, for example, the Kalahari Bushmen in South Africa were never part of the colony. They began the colonial period at about the same economic level as the other native populations in South Africa. They ended the period of colonialism more in greater degrees of poverty than the other South African tribal peoples who were there to begin with. They were basically Stone Age Bushmen to begin with, and they were Stone Age Bushmen at the end of colonialism. And it didn't really. It's not as if lack of colonization caused them to develop profoundly. By the same token, most peoples in locations which were colonized, from an economic point of view, were better off at the end of colonialism than they were at the beginning of colonialism. And given that people who weren't colonized were not necessarily better off at the end of colonialism than they were at the start, it seems fairly obvious that colonialism did not enrich the European powers that engaged in it, and did not impoverish the nations which were colonized to a greater degree than they were impoverished prior to colonization.
I guess, in a sense, I find it difficult to argue with your conclusion here. But if I'm going to do my best stab at taking up the contrary position, I guess I'd propose that you could imagine an alternative system than the way that colonialism operated in practice that would have led to greater equality. So this is not comparing pre- and post-colonial Africa, for example. This is comparing the actual effect of the European colonies to some other hypothetical system.
Yeah, so could these peoples who were colonized, there are a lot of different kinds of peoples who were colonized, have engaged in behavior that made themselves rich in the period of colonialism instead of what actually happened? Sure.
Well, okay. I guess it's both the as you mentioned, the Bushmen, who could have taken better, done better out of trading and taking advantage of new technologies, but also the people who were under, say, British rule. Could the British have done a better job of pulling everybody up together?
I mean, of course, but that's not the question. The question is whether like if colonialism never happened, would there be more or less inequality? Um, and the fact that colonialism could have been done differently to enrich the peoples who were colonized to some greater degree, sure, but that's not an answer to the question.
Well, what if you were to have somebody, suppose a super rich kid comes into a school and he starts sharing around, like he's got just bag full of sweets, and instead of giving everyone a sweet, he like picks his nearby friends and gives them all handfuls and handfuls of sweets, and most people just get one sweet when they could have had they could have had a small handful each.
I mean, I suppose that the one argument in favor of colonialism increasing inequality is that colonialism increased inequality in the parts of the world that were colonized. So not inequality between, for example, Britain and South Africa, but inequality between the various peoples within South Africa. I suppose it is the case that the people who benefited most from colonialism in South Africa, or in any of the other places which were colonized, they did really well out of the deal, and so it increased inequality in that respect. But the counter argument here again is that if you look at a place that wasn't colonized, like China, so China is an example of a sophisticated civilization which was not colonized, and still interaction with European powers produced the same effect of producing very dynamic winners and very dynamic losers inside of China, simply as a consequence of trade with European industrial powers.
So there was nothing unique about colonialism as opposed to simply
contact.
The progress of technology and
well, I would suggest that what actually created that inequality is contact, not colonialism. So regardless of how the contact played out, unless you've got like a hermit nation like Japan, contact with a sophisticated industrial power produces inequality in the society which contacts.
Well, that I think brings this round to the end. I'm going to give you a 9. Again, fantastic argumentation. I think between the first 2 rounds, I now understand inequality entirely. And let's move on to round 3. Cinema and theatre, world affairs, or epistemology?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I'm not famous for knowing movies very well, so maybe we'll strike that one. Yeah, actually, you know what? We'll go with cinema and theater. We'll see how I do.
Oh, okay. By the way, these questions you might notice are usually not specific to a given property, so it gives you scope to lean into things that you do know about. Cinema is most important for its visual spectacle. I don't know which word to emphasize there. Cinema is most important for its visual spectacle. Perhaps that's the way to think about that. We have lost the communal experience of storytelling. Or cinema and theatre perpetuate harmful stereotypes.
Okay. This is interesting. I won't take the we have lost the communal experience of storytelling thing, because I think that really depends on the community to which you belong. So that's for example, like if you participate in a church community, you have the experience of commonly following a narrative every week. So it's really.
I had Ed Dutton on last night, and he criticised my questions for sounding very undergraduate. I kind of see where he's coming from. I mean, if you read an academic paper, it would be hyper specific.
Yes.
Whereas these are more like,
But again, that's a change.
For conversation.
that's a change in the way that academia has kind of seen itself. So one of the things when I was a history student, I used to remark on between sort of 1945 and 1960, every single history professor wanted to write the general history of a long period of time. So somebody wanted to write the best history of Tudor England, or somebody wanted to write the best history of the Crusades or something. And now every academic paper, every academic book you see is hyper specific. It's like the history of basket weaving in like pre-modern England between 1487 and 1642.
Yes, exactly.
Sorry,
you were choosing
I don't think
a topic.
Yeah, okay, I better choose a topic. So cinema is not most important for its visual spectacle.
You want to pick that?
Yep.
Lock it in. Go ahead.
Lock it in. All right. So the argument here is that storytelling is the most important element of cinema. It connects with us most deeply on a psychological level. Human beings are biologically adapted to see their life in archetypal narratives. Those narratives are communicated primarily through as a thought experiment, you can watch the Lord of the Rings movies without any sound, or you can listen to the soundtrack and voice of the Lord of the Rings, and which of these two is going to give you a better sense of the archetypes that are communicated? Well, I think you can pretty clearly answer this by the popularity of the audiobooks with the soundtrack sitting underneath. So tens, hundreds of thousands of people will voluntarily choose to listen to it, and will consume the experience of the medium without a visual companion, and participate in the archetypal storytelling. Whereas participating exclusively in the visuals, you will miss a lot more. So it's not that spectacle is an irrelevant part of the cinematic form. It definitely has its place. But most of the storytelling in cinema is done either through dialogue or through the musical score.
Presumably vast number of blind audience who are reading the transcript of this are mightily relieved to hear that. Still experiencing the main part.
I think the actual answer here is that different people experience cinema in different ways. And so, like, if you were to ask somebody else, you would get a different answer on that. But certainly for me, I have very little interest in the spectacle of cinema.
So I could have predicted which way you would roll on this one.
Yes.
Well, I tell you what, I'll give you. Let's keep rolling because we took slightly more longer than the first two rounds than we should have done. I'm going to give you an 8, which is a very respectable score.
Okay.
And let's talk psychology, elite theory, or theology.
All right. Let's go with elite theory.
I thought you might choose that. Corporations have become the new aristocracy. Mainstream media is a tool in the hands of the elite, or a global elite shapes world affairs.
Corporations have become the new aristocracy.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's what we'll do, and I will argue in the affirmative. Corporations, and particularly the executive class of corporations, and particularly corporations which are publicly traded, have become. Well, okay. So I'm narrowing this question. Corporations and their kind of executive group have become a substantial element of the new aristocracy, right? So there are other members of the aristocracy who perform other activities, but if you look at the position of corporations relative to the state, corporations collect revenue on behalf of the state. This is one of their primary functions. So when the state is collecting its taxes, historically it collected it from the lords who collected rents from their tenant farmers. In the same way, corporations collect income tax on behalf of the central government. So they have the same role here, where they collect income tax from the plebs, gather it, and remit to the federal government, and then the federal government settles up with you for the difference, plus or minus, at the end.
Interesting.
So in that respect, they occupy the same position in the economic system as the aristocracy. Equally, they occupy the same position as the aristocracy because they're actors of means that the state can exert leverage on to enforce its social goals. So it's very difficult to enforce like a social, religious, or kind of state orientation goal on peasants. There's not much, if you want to assemble an army, it's you can pay the peasants, but there's not much you can do to retain their loyalty in the face of their potential death. Whereas because aristocracies have they've got a legacy and an extended family that has substantial value that you can threaten, you can compel them to do all kinds of things that you couldn't compel a peasant to do. And in the same way, because corporations have this, because they've got this life beyond the individual, you can threaten them and you can coerce them in ways that it would be very difficult to coerce individuals to behave. Equally, they're kind of, by their nature, cowardly against in the face of the state, because anyone who's brave within them can be dismissed for the good of the corporation. And in the same way, you've got aristocracies that are kind of bound into the governing formula of the society because they justify their position relative to their peasants as part of that governing formula. So I think it's a very comparable kind of situation.
Do you think that this has been the case since corporations first appeared, or is this a development that's happened? And if so, when, and what were the causes of that shift?
So the first joint stock corporations go back to like the late 18th century, and the first participants in those joint stock corporations are members of the aristocracy of the of either the Dutch republics or the United Kingdom. So I think it's kind of a smooth transition, whereas where the participants in early corporations were aristocratic in their own right, and as the real transition in the role of the corporation to being a conference of aristocratic class in its own right occurs as a result of two developments. The first is the centrality of capital in production. So you have the Industrial Revolution, which means property, plant, and equipment become integral in revenues instead of just land. And so this creates the possibility of an aristocratic class that derive their wealth from their ownership in a corporation rather than their specific title to land. And then the second is income taxes. So income taxes specifically because of the way that they're administered, put the corporation in this role as an aristocrat, responsible for the collection of rents from the plebs. Whereas in the period between sort of 1750 and 1914, you have this situation where the urban plebs are basically untaxed, which is kind of a unique situation in history.
So it's almost more like this, that incorporating is the new behavior of the aristocracy. Less of a circulation of elites, more of
in the period between 1750 and 1850, incorporating is the behavior of existing aristocrats. Between 1850 and 1914, you have a situation where you can enter the aristocracy by founding a corporation and succeeding in this new, succeeding in capturing a new source of revenue, and then at some point you have a calcification of the this element of the aristocracy, and you now have the situation where breaking into the corporate aristocracy is comparably difficult to breaking into the landed aristocracy in other eras.
I feel like the phrase that's emblematic of that period is nouveau riche. That there were people who had entered the aristocracy recently, and they, well, maybe I'm thinking of this in a particularly English way, but their habits were of the wrong class, as it were. So they were being invited to join into a social group to which they didn't, in a way, belong.
You actually find this in any historical period where the aristocracy becomes unusually permeable. So in periods that are disrupted by intensive warfare, by plague, whatever, you find permeability into the aristocracy for other reasons, and you find this same kind of disdain for new entrants.
What led to this change? Like, is this similar to other times where the aristocracy has been permeable? Like, do we think of it in the correct terms as the kind of the invention of capital and innovations in lending and things like this?
I don't think the concept of capital and lending really has much to do with it. Okay. This has to do with the value of accumulated property, plant, and equipment. So the fact that there's this period between sort of 1800 and 1914 where there are all these new monopolies in industrial production that are kind of up for grabs, or these new sort of economic positions in industrial in industry, creates this opportunity that creates a great permeability in the aristocratic class. You can kind of see this in the tech gold rush in sort of circa 1975 to maybe 2010, where you have a lot of new entrants to the American aristocracy that are coming through this route. But the fact that it's as a result of technical innovation that there's new openings, there have been lots of other vehicles through which that new openings have been created. So in the early colonization of North America, there were lots of new openings to the aristocracy in the colonies, because there was a lot of unoccupied land that people sort of gathered up. And certainly in the U.S. South, you created in a landed aristocratic class on the basis of a scramble for land that had occurred 100 years earlier. So there's some difference between previous periods of permeability into the aristocratic class, but I think the idea of difference is kind of exaggerated.
Okay, let's bring that round to an end. I'm giving you 11 for that, because I couldn't really imagine somebody answering that more effectively. So let's go on to the next round. Would you like technology, natural sciences, or Christology?
Technology, natural science, or Christology? We'll go with natural sciences.
Sure. These ones are fun. The risk of genetic engineering outweighs its benefits. Evolution is the origin of species. Or we can and should extend life indefinitely.
So we'll go with C. We can and should extend life indefinitely. We can't and we should not extend life indefinitely.
Nice.
And there's a theological reason for this, and there's a natural sciences reason for this. So the theological reason for this comes from Genesis. God says in the narrative of Noah, "I'll no longer bear with the long life of man. His days will be 120 years." Right? We have a direct word from God that says your life will be limited to approximately 120 years. So there's a theological reason why you can't. There's also a natural sciences reason why you can't. So where the science here is relatively immature, but we've discovered through our knowledge of genetics that the mechanism which causes aging is a limit on cell replication related to telomeric DNA. Broadly speaking, our cells have a fuse which prevents them from engaging in more than a certain number of divisions. This fuse is designed to prevent cell growths that go out of control. We call them cancer.
The Hayflick limit.
I believe so. Yes, I believe that's what it's called. So
if you don't stop your cells from replicating indefinitely, you get a tumor.
You'll get tumors, and you'll get potentially infinity tumors, right? We know. So, for example, we know that cell division goes out of control and is stopped by the Hayflick limit pretty regularly in humans. So if you try to address the Hayflick limit through some kind of genetic engineering, you'll immediately get into a position where you have a very large number of tumors appearing in that individual. We have no credible mechanism for dealing with especially diffuse tumors. Chemotherapy exists. It's modestly effective, but it exists by broadly poisoning the whole body. It's not a credible mechanism to address this problem at the scale that you would create it if you tried to alter the Hayflick limit. Equally, we're very, very far away from having the kind of technical capability to alter the Hayflick limit through genetic engineering. And I find it very unlikely that we're going to be in a position where sophisticated biological science goes on much longer in the face of, we're facing civilizational collapse. You typically don't see radical innovations of sensitive science like this in that kind of circumstance.
Now, if we were to just pull into the world of perhaps science fiction a little bit and suppose that it was conceivably possible, you mentioned that you would object to it on moral grounds. So what's wrong with wanting to extend life? Do you want people to die?
Yes, I want people to die. So I agree with God. Men are deceitfully, men are wicked. Death and the resurrection are an essential part of God's work in perfecting man for his heavenly kingdom. So the continued existence indefinitely of the unregenerated heart is of the unregenerated body, of the unregenerated soul, is not to God's glory, not desirable. And I know it's not desirable because God said so, but I also know it's not desirable because I know men, and they deserve God is right in his sentence of death for us. We deserve it.
So you're therefore a big fan and proponent and advocate for Canada's new maid policies. Then. Is that right?
We deserve death on exactly the timeline God promises to give it to us.
If
okay,
everything is
I should
God's
back up
hands,
a second. There's actually another element to this, right?
Okay.
So human beings are not psychologically adapted to being in control of certain decisions, and when they become in control of certain decisions, it alters their psychology in ways that are incredibly destructive. And you can to see a parallel. The invention of birth control is a great parallel here, right? So prior to birth control, prior to related innovations in figuring out exactly how to manage reproduction, reproduction was viewed as an inevitable consequence of appropriate behavior within marriage. And so because it was viewed as kind of an inevitable consequence, there's a whole moral and social system that developed around roles in society for men and women, and for generations that relate to this reality. So mankind hits headfirst into a hard reality and has to mold their behavior around this hard reality, and you end up with this really beautiful system that exists. You put man in control, or at least create the perception that he's in control of reproduction, and all of a sudden you have these incredibly destructive patterns of life that emerge out of the perception that man is in control of this item. I think if you try to put mankind in control of life and death, you will find incredibly destructive. You'll find that his deceitfully wicked heart will find innumerable ways to take this control and leverage it to do evil.
You know what? I'm gonna give you 12 points for that round on the basis that you answered the two halves of the question each in two ways, and I think your answer was bulletproof in every part. So you're getting the
coveted 12,
the world record score of 12. And let's move on to our last round. Literature, right. Software and mathematics, or eschatology?
Well, I'm famously not very good at eschatology. Literature's absurdly broad, and culture and software and mathematics, you're probably deeper than I am. We'll go with literature. See how that goes.
Yeah. Again, the questions are broad, so hopefully they're not. Hopefully they're not so specific as to give you nothing to talk about. That's how I designed them. The traditional literary canon is overrated. Children's literature is as complex and significant as adult literature. Or the distinction between high and low genre fiction is arbitrary.
Distinction between high and low genre. I'm taking the last one, and I'm taking the pure elitist view. The distinction between high and low genre literature is not at all arbitrary, and it is obvious to anyone who reads broadly. Okay? So why do I believe this? Well, at the moment, I've got 4 children. I'm an avid connoisseur of children's literature. And in the past, and to some degree at present, I'm an avid connoisseur of both high and low genre literature in the adult space. In either category, it is extremely obvious which pieces are written with the deep. So there's an objective map between patterns found in literature and archetypal patterns that are biologically built into the human brain. So, for example, when Tolkien writes about the return of the king to the derelict kingdom, he's not writing that story arbitrarily. He's writing about a pattern which is deeply imprinted in the human brain. And because he's writing about a pattern which is deeply imprinted in the human brain, there's an obvious map between reality and the abstraction into fiction, right? So because that obvious map exists, that is high literature, regardless of the audience for which it's intended. In the same way, when I go and read my kids, they have this series called Pinkalicious that they enjoy, where the theme of the story is that the girl really loves pink. All right. There's no map between the story which is presented and deep psychological reality. It's junk food. That's all it is.
Uh-huh.
And you can, both of these stories are, well, okay, we'll take a story, a piece of high literature targeted at children, The Wind in the Willows, which expresses archetypal realities that are built into human psychology pretty well. It draws on a deep historical tradition. It's kind of at the boundary between high and low literature. Maybe there's better, maybe there's worse, but at least there's definitely real connection in a story aimed at children to the deep archetypal underpinnings of our psychology. The Tales of the Brothers Grimm are this way as well. Even Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory hits archetypal realities inside our psychology really deeply. And you can see when you watch children consuming these things, the difference in reaction between the consumption of the two stories. One is psychologically fulfilling in a way which is obvious when you observe the children, and one is it's junk food. There's a kind of low pleasure in consuming it, but there's no growth in consuming it. And it's easiest to see this watching children consume it, because you can see when children are growing, and you can see when they're kind of engaged in low consumption. But I would suggest that if you look at the kind of people who consume, for example, who are readers of Game of Thrones versus readers of, I don't know, Shakespeare, you can see the difference in their development in consuming these two items. George R. R. Martin is very clearly writing for adults, but there's no archetypal reality in the stories that he's telling, nor is there deep insight about the way human beings actually are sitting inside those stories. Whereas Shakespeare is both a master of archetypal expression and also somebody who really, really understands human nature and expresses it very, very well. And so when you observe someone who consumes that content, they gain insight both into the archetypal structure of human psychology, and also kind of into the lower nature of the human condition. So there's the argument.
Is there a place for low genre fiction, or is it just useless and should be thrown out, and it should not be written, it should not be bought?
I mean, if you want to teach kids to read, it's nice to have light and airy content for them to read. So there's a place for it in that regard. Some people get pleasure out of reading kind of low fiction. I'm not a huge fan of it, but the idea of...
You're mentioning that it's lighter in area, easier to engage with. So is adding the more substantial, archetypal, the deep dives into human psychology and the experience of...
Well, it confronts you in a way that's demanding of the reader, right? So even something that's not particularly difficult. So The Hobbit is an example of a story that's not a very difficult story, but still it confronts you in a way that reading Teen Vogue doesn't, right? And I don't think that I think it's a useful activity when teaching people to read something that doesn't confront you. But I don't think that there's any value for adults in participating in low fiction. I think it's counterproductive.
How about within a single story that maybe will have moments of levity, moments of silliness? It could be a chapter that is a low genre chapter
Yeah.
within a total work. It's almost like giving you a bit of a break, almost time to absorb, and recover from some of the deeper, more grappling, more challenging chapters that you've already got to
So
slogged through.
I have two elements of my response to that. First of all, comedy doesn't have to be disengaging from a high and low literature point of view. I think there's something some comedy is very expressive about kind of the deep truths of human nature. So comedy is not by nature a low literature genre. However, there's definitely a rhythm to reading great works. You would have to ask, is there a place within a story for a kind of breath of air? That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I would suggest probably yes, but I don't know if that's the case.
Because in a way, if I imagine the perfect uncriticizable novel, if I was to read it and say that just could not have been improved, I don't think it would be relentless and almost.
No, great writing has a rhythm to it, right? This is one of my criticisms of Dickens. I don't think he has a good rhythm at all. Whereas if you read
the rhythm is you read a chapter of Dickens and then you have to wait a week until the next one is published. That's the rhythm of the original experience of Dickens.
Yeah, I and even his like short stories like A Christmas Carol, I don't find that they have a good rhythm to them, the way that some other authors do. Maybe that's my perception. I don't know, but I would say that part of the art of good writing is to have a rhythm which can be sustained by your reader, and exactly how you do that is, I wouldn't call myself a great writer, so exactly how you do it is kind of at the edge of my expertise. But I would suggest that you're probably right that varying the level at which you confront the reader through fiction is probably a useful tool at times.
Do you think that a story ought to have a clear good and evil? Or do you think, or conversely, do you think a story ought to show that the kind of the line between good and evil lies, inside the human heart of every man? Like, is there? Do you sit one side or other of that fence?
I would say that stories have to reflect archetypal underlying realities about the human condition, and externalizing evil is one archetypal element, but it is not the only archetypal element, right? So if you look at a story, which I would say is if you look at the kind of universe of archetypal stories, these stories which have been around in human society for thousands of years in one form or another, you see both. You see both externalized good and evil, and you see internalized good and evil. And I think they reflect the fact that both are part of appropriate human psychology. There's a way in which addressing externalized threats is an essential element of the human condition, and there's a way in which assessing the reality of sin within one's own community, sin within one's own person, is an essential element of the human condition.
Let's give you a 10 for that round. Again, brilliant treatment of those topics, and as you can see, I'm building a high score table. Let's find out where you sit. So you can see your competitors there.
Yeah.
You're at the top. You've got the new high score of Lamster of the Gauntlet so far. So congratulations on this
Well,
magnificent achievement.
I'm glad I've put Nathan in his place there. So
poor Pharaoh and Nathan. I mean, it did occur to me just in terms of format that it would feel emotionally uncomfortable for me to have a guest on and then reveal at the end of the show that they were at the bottom of the high score table. So I kind of
grade inflation might be a problem.
I kind of have built in the back of my brain the potential for a little grade inflation, just as a social lubricant.
Oh my goodness. Well, I will say it also really depends. Scoring really depends on getting the right question. Definitely that cinema question was I should have chosen better.
That's part of the gauntlet. That is entirely in the contestants' hands. Well, thank you for joining me, Black Horse, on Lamster 2024.
Thank you very much. I appreciated being invited.